Hey guys, Word Up here today to do something a little different, and that's to talk more generally about how melee as a role is shaping up in Legion. I've spent quite a bit of time with a lot of the classes now, but I'll definitely be leaning a bit more toward examples from the two I've spent the most time as, those obviously being Enhancement and Havoc, since those are the ones I've done a lot of the raid testing and a much more extensive amount of time in dungeons with as well. So, starting off at the very base, I'm going to look at encounter designs because those are the things that generally decide whether or not you want a melee or a ranged. So, a lot of the mechanics that I've seen in dungeons especially, but also more frequently in raids now than has been in the past, is that mechanics are much more avoidable than guaranteed damage. You can simply get out of the way if you're quick enough, or if you have the tools to move out of them, then you would normally, where you'd be expected to just take the damage, use it personal, or rely on a healer, rely on the tank to do something specific to avoid that damage coming to you, which is quite important generally because they've opted towards having a mobile versus durable kind of class design for the way that your non-damage spells actually operate. So some classes, say a Demon Hunter as an example, would be very mobile and their general goal is to avoid, whilst say a Death Knight is not as mobile, but they're intended to take less damage overall because they've got a lot of defensives on hand. Generally, abilities are a lot more telegraphed, so there's a lot more wind-up or animation before them, so you know that they're coming and that you need to prepare or do something to avoid it. So that plays into that again very strongly. Mobility is definitely more favoured than it was now, and it is more useful as opposed to having a finite reliability or usefulness during a fight where you only need to move or stay on the target or avoid one or two things. So that's definitely brought those two more in balance between defense and that. So generally what I've found is the split between a mobile class and a defense class is pretty fairly evenly down the 50-50 split at the moment, both in raids and in dungeons, as to how useful those tools are. Raids, AoE at the moment generally seems to just be king for your damage package. There's a lot of encounters in there that just tend to throw ads at you. That is the extra mechanic that you're going to have to deal with. That is how the fight is made more complex. So if you haven't got a lot of good AoE, there's a lot of encounters that you may simply just not be useful for. Obviously, a lot of those encounters have also got priority targets, so if you're really good at that, but your AoE is awful, you've still got some sort of tool that you can bring to the raid, as we've seen in some of the fights in Hellfire and BRF. So I wouldn't say that it is strictly going to be an AoE fest, but I would say that having a good AoE kit or some way of dealing AoE, in particular in a burst fashion, is going to be quite important if you want to be brought solely for the sake of your damage toolkit. The ability to snap target switch as well, much like in Hellfire is extremely useful, though that's not really something that's ever going to not be useful if there's ever any extra targets that are in a raid tier, and most raid tiers are going to rely on that in some mechanics, so that's not much of a surprise. Moving on to one of my least favourite buzzwords is the utility arms race that's been going on, and is a conversation that comes up literally everywhere. When you go any forum or any sort of discussion, someone brings up either a lack or an excess of utility on some class. So I suppose it's fair to actually touch on that in the melee camp. Some of the more egregious examples of utility for competing melee classes have been toned down a bit. In particular, for the big example is Mass Grip, which is now gone from DPS specs in its entirety and has instead been switched over to the tank specs in Blood and Vengeance. Defenses are now less required, as explained earlier with the mobility versus defense thing going on, but they are more impactful per use now because raid cooldowns aren't as common as they were or have been for quite a long time. The tuning on some of those, however, noticeably the new Havoc raid cooldown Darkness is a little bit off, so that's definitely skewing it a little bit because some of them are really quite strong, but I wouldn't expect that to be the final result. And obviously the Darkness one also has some fairly limited uses because it's completely RNG, being a raid-wide evasion. With the array of utility though, it does seem that DPS are going to be brought and thought of more in how their DPS package performs in different situations than necessarily purely on their specific mechanic cheesing ability, because that's a bit less frequent now, and also because a lot of the encounters being weighted towards the more AoE or damage-oriented tools are going to be decided on whether or not you can kill the things that you need to kill. But obviously, that completely remains to be seen, and also the tuning on said utilities, as I've already mentioned, could be a bit off, so we'll wait and see on that one. The damage variation then, as I've touched on in your toolkit, is very much going to depend whether or not you're going to be extremely useful as a specific spec or on a specific fight. So in that regard, burst AoE is still going to be king, much like it has been for a very long time now. So tools like Blade Storm, or if you want to go into WoD, things like Chaos Wave that Demo had. In the cases of right now in Legion, things like I-Beam for Havoc, really good ability, really useful tool. So you're going to see use almost guaranteeably at some point in the tier if you've got a tool like that. Priority damage, again, also I've touched on, really important. So if you're able to have a very frequently usable cooldown that instantly gives you a snap of a lot of burst damage or a lot of resources to dump on a target, that's going to be really useful. So things like, say, enhancements and doom wins, really great. So those are the kind of things that you're going to see big gains on. Extreme niches also do seem to be largely gone, though maybe not entirely gone completely. But tuning isn't yet in place, so some of the classes are a bit off, and it's a bit of an awkward position to be put in to guess whether or not they're going to be there. But things like we had in WoD with, say, Ferals being entirely focused on single target, Enhancement having Fire Nova be the be-all and end-all, and it was all about sustained AoE, doesn't seem to be as prominent or prevalent in the design goals of how the Legion classes have been done. So I would expect, to at least some extent, that that's going to be pulled forward for the rest of the design. A little touch on another bit of melee weirdness, which is the extraneous utility of Stormlash and Blessing of Might, which is a bit of an elephant in the room. Stormlash, as got confirmed by Celestial the other day, is basically a very complicated damage proc that comes from us, scales from our stats, and it's just dealt by another target in the raid group or the dungeon group as their damage, but apparently will be eventually counted as our damage in, say, log sites or so on. The bigger problem is Blessing of Might, which is more problematic, as that is entirely dependent on the target's damage. That could lead to some pretty awkward choices that you're going to have to make if you're playing Ret, that obviously Stormlash hasn't got there, because you've got no control over Stormlash, that just does its thing. I feel then, for Blessing of Might, it comes down to 3 different issues. That's rebuffing after a target dies, buff switching if someone else is going to be doing a lot of damage, or they're going to be doing a lot more attacks in a certain window, or generally having bad implications if Blessing of Might's damage is directly weighted against a Ret's damage that it's supposed to be dealing overall. It also is definitely going to have some issues as being a potential noob trap, as you can just have the buff on the wrong target from the very start, and misplaying before you've even pulled the boss is never a good thing to be doing. Lastly though, both of them have the problem that they are losing control over your own damage. It's going into someone else's hands, which, whilst it does play into the fantasy a little bit of you being a class that's helping your allies, and those are helping you in turn, it's just not fun, necessarily. I don't feel like when I play as either spec that I really get a lot out of it. It's just something that's there. Occasionally I'll notice the very loud Stormlash animation, but other than that, it doesn't really fill me with some sort of deep, ingrained excitement that I'm buffing my allies like, say, Wind Fury did a long time ago. It's just really there, and that's a bit sad, and maybe something that may have had a bit too much effort put into it compared to maybe some of the other aspects of both classes that could have got a bit more work in. Lastly, I'm just going to take a quick run over of the 2 new melee specs that we're going to have to be evaluating or competing against in the future. First of those being Survival Hunters. They have an instant problem that they have no real toolkit place that makes them special or different compared to any of the other melee that you could be taking. Now, obviously, your decision isn't made as to whether or not you like the toolkit when you're picking your raiders. So if someone really likes it, then good for them. And it is a spec that works. It's just not better or special than any of the other ones that you could have. Its damage is instead very shoehorned into a very small window and is by and large single target, whilst other specs can do that different type of style much better and more reliably, and they also have more flexibility in the tools they have outside of that compared to survival. Its base rotation is also quite slow outside of the Mongoose Bite window, which might be something that speaks to a certain player who wants that kind of style, but for me personally, I think it makes it very stop and start, which doesn't really help the flow of a melee class, which generally is something that you really want if you're playing a melee class to keep yourself involved in the combat. It also doesn't bring anything particularly unique outside of that damage package they have to encourage you being survival and therefore melee over either of the other hunter specs that are more rounded regardless of where they stand on the battlefield. Lastly, it's possibly a little bit too heavy on buff management with some of the talents, given that you've also got to manage your charges of Mongoose Bite, which is the core of the spec, and you also have to manage your focus on top of that, though that's not quite as important as it will be for some other classes' resources. Havoc, on the other hand, has definitely got something going for it, and it could definitely stand to be a very strong class come Legion, surprising no one really. It's got very high priority burst, and talents are extremely versatile for different situations that you may or may not want to play into. However, sustained AoE is the noticeable weakness, so fights in which you need that, maybe Havoc isn't the one that's going to be shining the best. Its mobility to avoid mechanics, as discussed earlier, which is now enhanced by design, is extremely high, very flexible, and it's also very reliable because of how low the cooldowns are, sans the animation cancelling that's going on that maybe does hurt the reliability of it accidentally not moving you anywhere, but I'd assume that that's not going to stay for Felrish in particular. The talents also give you flexibility on your defense side as well, and on your mobility, with talents such as Prepared, reducing the cooldown of Vengeful Retreat, and in particular with defense talents, giving you an immunity and Netherwalk, which, as everyone knows who's raided, having an immunity is a great tool, and you're always going to find a use out of it in fights that have some really weird soaking-oriented mechanic, or anything that's got some massive, super dangerous bursts that you have to avoid at all costs. That's what Netherwalk's going to do for you. I-Beam and Fury of the Illidari are both also effectively Blade Storm, so you've got two, and they're both very quick, and they are also both chaos damage, so they ignore armor and scale with your mastery, which means that they've got a good amount of room to grow. They've got a lot of different interactions with the artifact or with talents, and so you're going to see those both be very good tools, I imagine, as the future of the expansion continues. Havoc's big cooldown in Metamorphosis is also an enormous DPS increase, and you do an absolutely insane amount of damage while it's active. It's great for extended infrequent bursts, or with a talent like Demonic for more frequent bursts if you want to use that I-Beam to activate it. And so on fights that are quite short, or on fights where you have a very short period of time to kill something very important, having a cooldown like Meta is incredibly useful. And in dungeons where fights are a bit shorter in general anyway, you're going to get a huge amount out of it too. So Metamorphosis, big plus on that one, and also a good crux to the spec in general. That's it for a basic overview, not going too in-depth, just from my general impressions of playing them in the PvE sphere of what the alpha has at the moment. I'll probably be doing a few more of these as it progresses, and I got a bit more details on specific classes and when tuning starts especially. And I will consider doing something like this as a wrap-up for Warlords to compare the melee, so you've got a direct comparison of where they were and where they are now, which could come in the future. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys, and if you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below about what you did or you didn't enjoy about the video, and share it if you did as well. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time.